One of the things we have to do, and Gus encourages us to do, is to take risks occasionally. And this session, I think, is verging on the risky, because social class in this country is something that exists but never really gets talked about much. We've been pursuing a diversity agenda across the service for some years now, which has focused on race, on gender, on disability, sexual orientation, etc. But has actually shied clear of the question of social disadvantage. And a few of us discussing civil service live thought that it would be a good idea to break the taboo and have a session that's focused on that. So welcome. I'm glad so many of you have thought it interesting enough to join in. To host it, it's a great pleasure to me, because I've admired him from afar as a very serious broadcaster indeed, to welcome Matthew Mwaliwola. He is, I'm sure, well known to all of us as a broadcaster, but a broadcaster who does a lot more than read out cards and who really gets under the surface of the subject and brings a sympathetic quality to it. So let's welcome Matthew among us today.
Bill, thanks very much. Well, I have got plenty of cards today, and thanks, and it's lovely to see so many people here. I'm going to keep this introduction incredibly brief, because the title of this hour or so session, Does Class Matter in a Modern Civil Service, sort of speaks for itself. So I'll introduce the panel in a moment or two, but I just sort of, before we get going, just wanted to stress the point that with so many people here, I'm really keen to hear from as many people as possible through the course of this hour and 15 minutes, not just the people who've already supplied the questions. So broadly, if you think of something, you hear something you want to spin off, you don't quite agree with, want to agree with, just put your hand up. We'll make sure one of the roving microphones finds you. And I think probably the best way to do it is, as you're listening to things, and if you want to say something, if you put your hand up, it then makes it easy for me to actually draw on you and call on you, as well as all the people who've supplied questions. So that's roughly how the format is going to work for the next hour or so. Let's get to the panel, and we've heard from Bill already, but Sir Bill was saying, Sir Bill Jeffrey, he is, as you all know, Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Defence, but also the Civil Services Diversity Champion. In his previous roles, they've included Permanent Secretary of the Immigration and Nationality Directorate and Political Director at the Northern Ireland Office. So welcome to Sir Bill. David Bell is the Permanent Secretary for the Department for Children, Schools and Families, and education is absolutely in his DNA. He has also been a Chief Inspector of Schools in England. He's been an Ofsted Inspector and a primary school head teacher. Paul Jenkins is Permanent Secretary of the Treasury Solicitors Department and Head of the Government Legal Services. He's been Legal Advisor to many of the government departments, as well as Diversity Director at the Department for Constitutional Affairs. Tim Campbell, on the end, you'll recognise him, the winner of The First Apprentice. He worked for Sir Alan Sugar's Amstrad Company before setting up his Bright Ideas Trust, which supports young people as they try to start their own businesses. And he's also the Cabinet Office's Social Enterprise Ambassador. And finally, Sue Owen joins us, Director General of Welfare and Wellbeing for the Department of Work and Pensions. She started her career, she was telling me a little while ago, as an economics lecturer, joined the civil service in 1989. In 1998, she worked for family policy at Number 10, has had long spells with the Foreign Office, the Treasury, before her current role. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is your panel this morning. Please welcome them. Now, let's get to the chase, and Sarah Brunning has our first question. If you want to just say where you're from as well, as you answer your question.
Hello, Sarah Brunning from the Ministry of Justice. My question is, does an old school tie still count for more than it should in the civil service?
Does an old school tie still count more than it should? So, Bill, why don't you kick off?
I think it probably counts for more than it should, but less than it did. When I look back to the civil service that I joined a very long time ago, it definitely did then. I think it was a world in which most people were men, for one thing, in the senior ranks, men of a particular social background who often shared a similar educational experience. I would say we moved a long way from that, but one of the points I wanted to make in this session is that I think we still underestimate the extent to which, for those who don't have the blessings of all that's captured by the phrase old school tie, the civil service can be quite impenetrable, at least at first. So getting there, a long way from where we were, some way still to go, I would say.
Sue.
Well, I think it matters a lot less than it used to, and I think it varies a lot by department, actually. A lot of the departments I've worked in thinking about those, the top of the Treasury, the top of the Foreign Office, old school tie, there's more of that than, for example, in the department I'm now in the Department of Work and Pensions. And I think that's partly because the civil service has come to recognise the importance of delivery skills and financial and corporate skills as well as policy skills. And in my department now, which employs 100,000 people, it's the ability to run things like job centres and pay out pensions that's very important. And if you look round our board, I wouldn't say the old school tie is there at all.
Paul?
I think we have to be slightly careful about terminology here. I was reflecting on exactly this issue and thinking, I went to a state school in North London, and my school also produced Sir Lee Lewis, who's the permanent secretary at DWP, and Sir Nigel Scheinwald, who's our ambassador in Washington. We don't have an old school tie, but it was a fantastic state school in North London. And I think what we have to look at, I mean, I agree with everyone else, I don't think it matters anywhere near as much as it did. I didn't feel unwelcome when I joined the civil service, but I did come from a background that was different in those days. But I think we've got to be a bit careful these days about badging it up like that, just based on my experience of one school producing quite a lot, really.
Tim?
I think it's, thanks for the question, sir. For me, it's quite important that you're from the Ministry of Justice. My wife is a fantastic example of where I don't think the old school tie actually really reflects what's happening in the civil service at the moment. She started working out in the court service as an usher and has progressed right through to a senior level in the Ministry of Justice now, doing audit and risk advice. So for me, it may still have undertones, and it's quite important that Sir Bill talked about risks and being open to more risks. But the fact is now that there's opportunities because we've made it more clear and transparent about how people can navigate the senior positions within the civil service and hopefully break away from those old school mentalities.
David?
I'm very proud of my old school tie, which was from Glasgow's first purpose-built comprehensive school. So I don't think it really matters as much as it probably did. I can only speak on my experience from coming into the mainstream of the civil service in 2006. And I have to say I was surprised that it didn't count for more. In other words, I thought that there would be many, many more people who, as it were, wore the old school tie. There are still aspects of it, and there are still pockets where there is more likely to have people from a rather narrow background. But I think generally and over time, the civil service has changed quite dramatically.
It's not entirely scientific, and I think we've probably heard a couple already, but just whiz down the table and tell me, private school or state school, just on the panel that we got.
Fantastic comprehensive that was rated outstanding by Ofsted last week.
Well, it must be right then. Fantastic state school in Glasgow.
A fantastic state school in Glasgow, and I do begin to wonder about the diversity of this panel, actually.
Sue?
I'm old enough to have been in the 11+ generation, so I had a free place to a private school.
A fantastic state school in North London.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it, given the current makeup and what we're talking about. Sarah, you asked the question. What is your impression in terms of why you asked it?
I would agree. I think the perception is changing. I think with diversity and equality policies in place, there are more opportunities for people. I myself am from a state school background and have a university education, but I'm still working my way up.
But do you think it is a factor, even if it's changing?
I think it could potentially, I mean, as a graduate, it could potentially, you could progress further if you're from one of the more prestigious universities. But I do think that's changing.
Okay. Thank you. Let's move straight away to Michelle Campbell. Not quite sure where she is in the audience, but Michelle Campbell, are you here with your question? Well, let me just paraphrase to the panel what it was. She makes the point that the Cabinet Office's study in April showed that 45% of senior civil servants are privately educated, and that's only compared to 7% in the population. With that in mind, how will we recruit from schools in the future? How will we monitor what we're doing and what is being done to actually make sure the civil service reflects the community that we serve? David.
Well, I'm surprised about that data because I thought the one thing the civil service didn't collect was information about school background. That might be another question, but it doesn't. I think it should. Yes, it should. Because I think it's an interesting indicator of where people have gone to school and what we might have to do as a civil service to make ourselves more attractive to youngsters from all sorts of different backgrounds. It is certainly going to be the case still that those who get to the more senior positions are likely to have had a university education, as Sarah pointed out. And I think that's just part of the changing social trends, because, of course, one of the great social revolutions of the past 40 or 50 years is the opening up of higher education to people from all sorts of different backgrounds. So I think that will be the case. The real task for people like me and those who work in the education system is to make school background irrelevant when it comes to university choice and selection, and therefore, whatever school you go to, you should have as much chance as possible of getting into higher education, if that's what you want to do, and then getting into whatever job that you want to do. So I'm not blaming the universities, and I'm not blaming the civil service. We've all got a responsibility, and that responsibility begins at school.
Sybil, if you are to tackle this, isn't David's point right that perhaps the starting point is actually to collate the statistics?
I think there's a case for doing that. We tend not to trust the service. We arguably ought to. I'm not myself sure that this sort of private state school distinction is the key to this issue, though. I think, first of all, one key to it is the one David's indicated, which is more to do with wider social policy, to ensure that university entrance, with all that that brings, is evenly distributed and people properly have the aspiration to do it. But the second thing is about the kind of organisation we are, and whether, if you come into the civil service, you feel that this is an organisation in which, whatever your background, you're part of it. It is, to use a phrase that British Telecom used, effortlessly inclusive. I think we should aim to be effortlessly inclusive so that whatever people's background, when they come in, they feel that this is an organisation that provides opportunities and that you can advance through. And the disadvantaging feature is not so much whether you went to a state school or a private school, because by chance almost this panel is littered with people who went to state schools, in some cases many years ago. It's more about expectations. It's about, I mean, did you grow up in a family where the expectation is that you will achieve highly, you will go to university, you will do these sorts of things. And we've somehow got to make ourselves open to those whose starting point isn't as high expectations as most of our families probably had of ours.
Sue.
Did they say what that 45% is? Is that of the senior civil service?
Senior civil servants, yes.
Okay, all right. So that includes people who've come into the senior civil service over a long time. It'd be quite interesting to break that down by people most recently recruited to the senior civil service and see if that's better. And my guess is that number will be a bit less. But the civil service in Britain has always aspired to be a meritocracy and to get away from the advantages that money brings with you. And that when the Northcote Trevelyan reforms came in and introduced recruitment by examination, that was trying to move away from that. But of course, that still entrenches the advantages of education. But something else we then try and do once you're in the civil service, and however you were recruited to it, is to try and make sure that elevation within the civil service is on the basis of merit. And I think from what Tim was saying, from the example of one of my stepsons who came into the civil service without A-levels and is now as far advanced as he almost certainly would have been had he been at university, I think we do a pretty good job on that. And when you add to that the fact that we are now trying to set ourselves diversity targets and to check what we're doing, I would be very surprised if those numbers continued into the future.
Tim, you've done a lot of work clearly outside, as well as having more recent contact with the civil service. In terms of that contact, does it feel to you that it reflects the wider society out there?
I've had several dealings with several different departments, from DWP to CLG, a number of different departments in the capacity of trying to get more young people to start their own businesses. And usually the more senior I get, the more evidence it becomes that individuals are maybe from a different class than where I'm from. I don't particularly see that as an issue because I like the personal challenge of seeing if I can hold my own. I don't mind that, but I am aware of it. However, I think we've got to widen the argument and not getting on a Marxist hobby horse about steal back the power from those who may have it. I see it, we've got to widen the recruitment processes to say that I don't mind if you've got an old school tie or a cheap necktie like my one. I don't really care, to be perfectly frank. But what I'm more important, are you the best person for the job? And are we doing all we can with regards to recruitment processes to open up the opportunities to everybody? So, for example, are we putting public advertisements in publications that only certain sectors of the community will read? So I will pick up the Sunday Times, and my mum might pick up the News of the World, and I know I won't see an advert in the News of the World for some of the senior positions that may be advertised in the civil service. The other thing I have a big issue with is the assessment criteria we have for particular jobs and the lower level that's placed on maybe vocational education. And it's only seen that if you go to university, that's the only way that you're going to be deemed as a success. In business, for me now, the individuals we recruit and the people we support in business, they may not have the academic background, but they have the natural savviness to be able to make a success. I don't know how we get that incorporated as a benchmark to see where people can actually come into the service, but we need to have more than just one narrow criteria to assess if people can do the job.
If I could just pick up. I agree very much with that, but I think it's not just casting the net wide on recruitment, which we must do and increasingly are doing. If you look at our recruitment at our main points of entering the civil service, it is very diverse. The real question is what happens once people are in. Do they find, or do they feel once they're in, that this is an organisation that they're part of and can contribute to and are valued in? Or do they feel that it's a somewhat alien environment that they've got to learn and adapt themselves to? And I don't think we've got that quite right yet.
I'll come to that once you're in a moment. I've got two quick questions which we've touched upon already, which feels right to actually come to. I'll come to Tina Perry first, because it spins off what Tim was saying. Let's just deal with getting in, first of all. Is Tina Perry here? Now, you sent in a number of questions.
Tina Penny from the
Penny.
Valuation Office Agency.
Apologies. Just tell me, you had a question about actually being a huge employer and actually doing more to actually go and recruit. Just tell us what you want to know.
My question is building on the same theme, actually. Does the panel think that as a huge employer that we could provide more information and advice to local secondary schools, really to look at encouraging students from lower social class backgrounds to actually apply and get interested into civil service careers?
Sybil, why don't you take that on board in terms of actually what is being done in the secondary schools to actually get people in from those areas that you want to see more people?
I think we could do more. I think this is something that tends to be dealt with at the departmental level, and some departments I think are stronger than others. Those that are represented all around the country, like DWP, like my own department, the Ministry of Defence, like Customs and Excise, Revenue and Customs, I should say, there is usually more of a local presence and more of a footprint, including in the schools. But I think we probably could do more than we have done. There's quite a lesson to be learned from the people I work closely with at the moment, who are the armed forces. They're not always completely successful, and they too have issues of the kind we're discussing this morning. But they are very, very good at getting right into the community and looking for people from all quarters and with all backgrounds.
Sue?
I completely agree with that. I think that's a very good idea. I have myself in my career been into schools on one occasion when I was in the Treasury and we were working on the decision about whether the UK should join the Euro. And once we'd made that decision, we had a kind of roadshow, and we went round the country and indeed to other countries. And we did give the presentation in some schools, actually. I mean, obviously, we just were able only to pick a few. But we did that, and that was a very rewarding experience, and I think, you know, was an opportunity to explain to school kids the stuff of government and hopefully encourage them.
Paul, you touched on it a little earlier, but I remember from my own school days, we would regularly get, and it's interesting what you were saying, the armed forces turning up, and regularly, more than just once. Never once can I remember anyone from the public sector saying, actually, look at all of this.
But I think, Matthew, thank you. I mean, you're right, I touched on the schools already, and I think that's hugely important. The other area we should look at, and I'm starting to target, is the newer universities, because actually, from my perception, the newer universities have a much more diverse student intake than some of the older universities, and I think we should also be focusing there more.
Quite a lot of this actually happens, for example, through careers advice that young people will be given at school, and looking at a whole range of careers in the public sector, including the civil service, and I know that we are quite active there. But I think I just also want to link back to something Tim said, because it's equally important, and that is, what sorts of opportunities are there to come into the civil service apart from via the graduate route? We've got quite an expansion now of public sector apprenticeships, and that includes a very large commitment now to ensure there are central government departments offering apprenticeships. The new diploma in public service, which is going to be offered very soon, is another way of giving young people the experience of civil service and public services generally. So I don't think it's just about advice, it's about ensuring that there's a range of qualifications available to young people so that they think that the civil service and other public services are a route. And just finally on the point about the other universities, if we're back to graduates, I mean, the civil service fast stream has over recent years been drawn from a much more diverse number of universities. It is not now the case at all that it's only the so-called good universities in the country, Glasgow and Edinburgh, that people actually come from. You'll now see lots of the more modern universities, and a lot of our targeting of effort on the civil service cabinet office side is to go precisely into those universities and encourage young people that might not have thought of the civil service as a graduate career.
I think 70% of the 2008 fast stream intake was not from Oxbridge. It still means that 30% was, but there you are.
Tim, you talked about it earlier, but I mean, presumably there is huge scope at that level, at secondary school level.
A huge amount. As a school governor myself, and an individual who goes around to many schools across the country, I hear lots of young people who have an issue with the career service that they get and career guidance they get at formative stages in their development. And I think from an external perspective, which I think is quite valuable at something like this, and please don't throw anything at me before I leave, as I'm about to say this, but the younger individuals have the perception that it's an older, wiser, more stale organisation. And there's an awful lot of work that's been done to counteract that in terms of the diversity strategy that's been implemented. But that is not being disseminated down to young people who potentially could see it as a career opportunity. If you sold to somebody that you could have a lifelong career in several different departments and see virtually the world in terms of from your office, that would be something much more interesting than what my mum's perception, and still a lot of people who are being told by their parents about the civil service, where it's somewhere where you go if you can't make it in the private sector. And that's what we're challenging against, I think, I put myself as the royal we, as an organisation, to get out to the individuals, that we don't want just people who can't make it anywhere else. We're dynamic and talented individuals, and that's what we're looking for, regardless of what university or class sector you come from.
Let me ask Ruth Ludbrook. Is she? Well, you've got the microphone there, so why don't you ask a question anyway? Tell me who you are.
My name's Kirat Gori. I'm an intern at the DCSF. I know initiatives are in place like the Summer Development Programme, which I was lucky enough to get on, which is open to ethnic minorities and those with disabilities or learning difficulties. So it's fine enough that I've gotten onto this, but what are the chances of me actually progressing and getting far once I apply into the fast stream? Because speaking to fast streamers of them said she was the example of being the most diverse candidate there, and she was an upper middle class white female from Bristol University. I know I might not be discouraged from applying because I'm quite confident and will apply, but I know others in my position won't. What's being done to encourage those, and what is the chance of the civil service finally being reflective of not just class and diverse in terms of just class, but also ethnicity?
That's very interesting. Sue, and a specific reference there to fast streaming, and I suppose in one sense it has quite a lot of benefits, but the point there is if you're only taking from that smaller pool, then actually you're building some sort of problem into the system.
I think there are quite a lot of initiatives on ethnic minority as a lens for diversity, but we're still not doing anything like well enough. And of course, we lack role models at the top. That said, we do have Suma Chakrabarti, who's the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Justice, the first non-white Permanent Secretary. We also have Minouche Shafiq, who runs the Department for International Development. So we are beginning to build some role models. My own view of the fast stream, actually, I don't know what, I haven't said this to other members on the panel, is that I think that we shouldn't recruit to the fast stream people in their early 20s. I think we should wait until people have done several years of experience in the civil service before we recruit to the fast stream, so that we get a much better test of what people are really like in their jobs, and not just the degree or the university that they came from. And we'd then be able to pick more people, I believe, who maybe didn't have degrees at all, and from probably a wider range of universities. Of course, we're also in the civil service doing quite a lot of recruitment, not at the early stages, but higher up. We're doing a lot more recruitment direct from outside. So David, for example, was recruited direct to being a permanent secretary, and that's another way that we can push towards our various diversity targets by recruiting people at all the different stages.
Paul, your view on that specific point about just that pool, the fast stream pool?
My experience as the lawyer, we don't really use the fast stream, so my experience is slightly different. It's not quite a direct comparison, but we take a lot of legal trainees, and they're the people we invest most in terms of training and development. And what we've seen over recent years, I hope and think, as a result of our initiatives, going out to the universities much more, and going out with role models who don't look like me, if I'm honest. I can't go out and convincingly say to people, come and join, because I look like some people's perceptions of what the civil service is. But if I use people like Patricia Scotland, she's a far more convincing role model. And going out into universities with people who've got a convincing story to tell about success in the government legal service is leading, I see, to the trainee pool becoming much, much more diverse.
Tim, I mean, you go out and do exactly that. I mean, just tell us a little of your experience. Does it feel like when you speak to audiences like that youngsters connect, and then you have a chance of actually saying, these are options for you?
There is the obvious superficial level when you go out to speak to in some inner city schools, where people can say, okay, you represent an image of myself, therefore I believe that you made it possible, you can go and do it. But I want to really move away from that in terms of I'd much better prefer that we had as much information on display where people can make sensible choices about what options they should take, rather than just having it focused on we need to have a role model that represents individuals, which is a great catalyst. But then once they're in, as Sybil was saying, that's when we've really got to make the difference, once we've actually captured that new intake. And just like when I used to work at London Underground, which is now TfL, it was very similar. At the lower levels of the organisation, we had fantastic diversity, and it was there evident at all levels, at the lower grades. But then as you go through a hierarchical structure, there's limited spaces, there's limited options, limited choices. But we just have to make sure that we have, as we did in London Underground, a robust system that was transparent and people could actually see that they were not being disadvantaged because of a process that they couldn't control.
Before I bring David and Bill back in, let me go back to the questioner. What did you think of Sue's idea of perhaps waiting a few years and actually seeing how people are actually doing within the job before you decide on fast streaming?
Is quite rigorous, so I think it'd be better if you had, because as you say about a young child, it's always easier to pick up things when you're younger. So in my opinion, I would much rather go into an organisation, pick up everything and work my way up rather than be somewhere else for 10 years, then come into the fast stream and having to relearn the techniques and processes that are more suitable for the civil service itself.
Phil?
I mean, I think Sue's point was really about people coming into the civil service, then spending some time in the civil service and then getting into the fast stream. And I don't completely agree with her. I don't think that should be our only source of getting people into the fast stream. I think we should do what we do now, which is a mix of drawing people in directly, but also having a very strong encouragement to our existing people that this could be for them, actually, and not to assume it isn't because they happen to have come in some other fashion. So it goes back to my earlier point. Somehow from the top and in the middle of our big organisations, we've got to make people like yourself feel not that this is for somebody else who's been at Bristol University, etc., but that I've got the ability to do this, and I'll give it a go. And if we create that sort of atmosphere, then we can begin to change things.
Could I ask a slightly different question as I come to you, David, which is, I mean, you're right at the top of the tree in your various departments. What specifically have you done to widen the net since you have been where you are?
Well, I can cite particularly, I think, the work that we've done on gender diversity, and I just want to make a link with that to some of our issues regarding black minority ethics staff. We now have a board that's 50% men, women. Our senior civil service is now majority women. Our directors' cadre is 50-50. Our pools going into the senior civil service are 50-50. And we've really in the last few years made very substantial efforts to diversify the pool. Now, I think there's a quite interesting question about the kind of department we are. That perhaps it could be argued that our department, which will serve a workforce which is probably predominantly female, or it's certainly more mixed male-female, that's a workforce out in the system, maybe to some extent the government department reflects that, and it reflects the interests of people who've come through the department. That's something we've been thinking about. To what extent is our experience capable of being replicated across the civil service more generally? I think it has opened up then the question of why is it that we've been able to make that progress on gender diversity where our progress on BME diversity has been slower. And I think, again, it goes back to some of the things we've been talking about already. The pool of, the so-called pool of talent that at the top levels of the senior civil service probably reflects, to some extent, the society of the 1970s and 80s, if you get to the very top. But what we're trying to do is to ensure that we've got more people coming in. And what you said about the fast stream in our department, incidentally, I should say, is not the case despite that person you spoke to, because actually our fast stream has been increasingly diverse in recent years, not least populated by people who've done the programme that you're on at the moment. It's also the case too that our talent pool at the level below the senior civil service is looking more diverse, but frankly we're not there yet. We do not have the representation from BME backgrounds at our director cadre, so that's sort of senior levels and above, or actually even to the kind of level I would want in the senior civil service. So we've got to try to learn lessons from what's worked, but the kind of scheme that you're on at the moment, the summer internship scheme, I think opens up the possibility for you to apply, and it seems to me that that's something that will help us as we move forward.
Sue, let me ask you the same question. I know you've only been there since April, but what specific things have you done to cast the net wider?
Well, for myself, it's not particularly related to the department that I'm in now. I've always tried to be a role model for women when I was in the Treasury, where there weren't very many, well, there are none at the top. When I was in the Department for International Development, my last job, and the one I'm in now, I'm doing some work for the top 200 group on looking at just the sheer facts of what's happened to women moving into the senior civil service. And there is some good news here. I mean, women are being promoted internally to the senior civil service disproportionately to their numbers in the grade below. So we're beginning to do quite well. Progress is slower as you move further up, but there is progress. And I think in the permanent secretary ranks now, about 4 of the most recent appointments have been women to the permanent secretary grade. So the nature of that table that meets on Wednesday mornings is beginning to improve as far as women is concerned. The group I run has looked at quite a lot of causal factors for women and confidence issues, flexible working, all that kind of thing. And one of the things that I've encouraged, and isn't universal yet, but is when you have interview panels, always to include somebody more junior than the grade that is being interviewed for. And that's quite a powerful way of really assessing people for their abilities at management and leadership, and what sort of person they would be like to work for. A couple of departments do that, but by no means all.
Now, I said I'd come to Ruth Ludbrook and her question in a moment. I will, but I just want to really rattle through with Bill. Just a few sort of just factual questions. As a diversity champion, I mean, just 2 or 3 quick-fire questions. We keep hearing that there is change, but people talking about the pace of change. Frustrating?
For me?
Yeah.
Yes, to a degree. I mean, you didn't ask the direct question of me, but I happen to be in charge of a department which comes from a very different base from David's, for example, where the defence world is a somewhat white male world. And we've, over the last few years, concentrated in particular on getting more women into senior positions with a degree of success. I think this agenda is always going to take time, because although it needs enthusiastic application by all of us, and I can assure the audience receives it, to some extent it is about, over time, exploiting the fact that we have in the main feeder grades for senior positions a much more diverse population than we ever had in the past. So to some extent the issue is about providing the time and encouragement for these people to come through. It's frustrating in some respects that isn't happening more quickly. I agree with what David said. I think we're making more progress on women than we are on minority ethnic people.
Okay, factually, quickly, here we are, 2009. 2012, what are your targets on these range of things?
Well, we have pretty stretching targets in the current version of the Civil Service Diversity Strategy, in particular to get the percentage of women in senior civil service positions up towards 40% over the next few years, with a view to hitting 50% not long afterwards.
What's it now?
Now it is in the mid-30s, 34%. That sort of. Now, I mean, interesting, we've moved on in this discussion from where we started, which was social disadvantage, onto the conventional diversity agenda, as it were. But on that agenda, the thing the civil service can take some pride in is that in the senior reaches, it is a more diverse organisation, particularly in relation to gender, than most outside are. I mean, our top management is just below 30% female. Our SCS is mid-30s%. Look at most of the outside world at very senior positions, and you don't see these sorts of percentages.
So those are the wider figures. Let's get to Ruth's question, because that specifically brings us back to today's focal point of the discussion. There she is there.
My question relates to the proposal to have a socio-economic monitoring duty on the public sector. How do you measure class in a way that's meaningful, and what do you do with the information once you have it?
It's interesting, given what we said earlier about measuring figures. We heard, I think, from David saying perhaps schools wasn't the best thing to actually look at. So Ruth's question, how do you measure class in a way that's meaningful? And then what do you do with the information once you've got it?
I think this is a big challenge for us. I think we have to respond to the prospect of this duty in a sensible fashion, that doesn't just impose a huge bureaucratic burden on everybody, but does actually give us information that we can work with. I don't personally feel we have an answer to it yet, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend that we do, but it's a very, very important issue. And we have to work out a kind of proportionate way of complying with the duty, and in the process getting information that will actually help us manage the service better.
David, you made the point earlier that you didn't think schools was the right thing to actually judge things on. So what are you suggesting is the best way to measure this?
Well, funny enough, I did actually say that I think that it would be useful as an indicator to understand where people went to school. But of course, that doesn't in itself direct you to particular kinds of actions. What it does is give you information about the range of backgrounds that people come from. And it may be, for example, the case if you found out that particular grades were dominated by people who went to a particular kind of school, you can then consider some actions, perhaps going back to what was said earlier by Tim about information that needed to be available. So it's only ever going to be a sort of proxy indicator of background and potential advantage that it brings. So I think it would be useful just to understand what kind of school background people have come from, so that you get a sense of what you might actually do about it. But Bill's right. The wider public sector duty and the proposal for that does still need, I think, some working out, because we don't want to just impose a bureaucratic burden. Because the worst thing you could get with any of these targets or duties is that people do it in a tokenistic way and then don't do anything to change their behaviour or actions.
Well, we've been talking about class as represented by type of school and education, but of course, when you measure social class of people, it's very much about the occupation that they're in, and traditionally the differences were white collar and blue collar occupations. A lot of that now is much more fuzzy. We have a much more complex service economy. The middle class, nearly everybody is middle class these days, whereas 200 years ago, nearly everybody, or 70%, would have been working class. Now, of course, Marx saw class as being access to capital. These days, people's idea of class is much more about relative advantage. There are lots of factors. There is access to capital, but there's education, there's your parents' education, there's housing. Father's occupation used to be a very important indicator. Now a lot more women are working. So occupation of your parents. If you were going to do this objectively, it'd be really quite difficult. So you could cut through all of that by having type of school that you went to as a kind of indicator, but I think it'd be very much only an indicator.
I wonder if the microphones could get to the gentleman there with his hand up who wants to make a point there. And then after that, I'm going to ask for a question from Danny Williams, if he's ready with that.
My name is Mike Wheeler. I'm from the DWP. I'm just interested as to, obviously if you're trying to do some kind of survey, I suppose, to work out what class we're from. I mean, it is very, very interesting as to how you're going to work it out. I mean, initially, the whole discussion was based on education. It's really interesting to hear that now you're going to be looking into other areas. I mean, there's also things like political beliefs that need to be taken into account. But one of the issues that I would have is, I mean, in the DWP, we've got a lot of staff there that don't like filling out skills surveys. They don't like having their employer look at their education background or their current literacy and numeracy skills, because we're in a department that at the moment is recruiting. We all know as we come out of recession, there's going to be redundancies. And one of the issues that I would have is a lot of people, I mean, I consider myself working class. You'll probably find out I'm middle class if I went through your criteria. And we'd been then looking at, well, aren't we going to be the people that are first out the door? Because what we're seeing on the ground at the moment is the people that consider themselves working class, have working class politics, are less likely to be promoted through. And sometimes it's very blatant. I've been told because, I'm an active trade unionist and I've been turned down for promotion because I'm a trade unionist and they don't want me in a management position. And I've been told that to my face, not in writing, so I can't challenge it. And these are the issues as well. It's also to do with our politics.
Sue.
Well, that all sounds very worrying. I must say, I've been in the DWP for 3 months, and I will certainly take that particular issue away and talk to people about what that is. I didn't actually say we were going to do all of this. What I said was that the ways that social class is measured is actually quite complicated, and I think we'd have to think very carefully before we went down that route, because of course appointment and promotion should be on merit.
I'll come to promotions in a moment. The lady there, 4 rows back, was trying to get in, so...
I think actually you've acknowledged the issue. I'm very nervous about social class being measured by the school of attendance, because I went to a state school, but I would say I'm the most upper middle class person ever. You know, I've got parents with high expectations of me. My parents both went to university. I would not say I'm working class at all. I went to Cambridge as well. I don't know if that has a factor, but I think you've got to look at the parents' background, not just the type of school, because many middle class people now go to state schools, and also maybe the quality of the state school as well.
Paul, it's interesting, isn't it, that already you get a sense that it is quite a complicated thing to try to pinpoint, to give you some set of figures that you can then work off.
It is, and I'm not an expert in terms of measuring things, but what I have a very strong sense of is we need to take one step back and remember why we think diversity is important. And diversity is important because if we're going to provide public services, and that's what we're all in the business of doing, we can provide them better if we understand the population that we're serving. I sometimes say, you know, I go to work sometimes on the 36 bus, and I want the civil service in South London to look like the 36 bus and to have the same degree of diversity there. And diversity around social aspiration and background is so God knows how you measure it.
It's interesting because that was one of the questions, whether asking the point whether it actually impacts on what the civil service actually does, who it contains. I mean, are you convinced that it does?
It absolutely must do. I mean, I've been banging on about diversity for years, and I think I used to get very irritated with people who said you should focus on the business case for diversity, because I think that's actually a very strong moral case. But that's not a very fashionable line to push. So focus on the business case. And actually, yes, when I was in what is now the Ministry of Justice, if you went into a courtroom in South London and it didn't look like the 36 bus, so you had a white judge, you had a mainly white jury, which was really strange. Juries selected from a cross-section of population. What was going on there? Why were people from ethnic minority backgrounds not ending up on juries? Why were all the court staff white? Quite often you go into court and the only person who was different was the person in the dock. That's wrong. And we would be much better at delivering effective justice and convincing the person in the dock that they were getting effective justice if the court looked more like the community.
Now, we've got about 20 minutes left, so if you want to pitch in, please put your hands up. As Phil, you want to dive in before I move on? Go on.
I may dive in, Matthew. Just to very warmly agree with the last questioner. I mean, I think myself that what sort of school you went to is the most shadowy proxy for this issue. I mean, this issue is actually about advantage versus disadvantage. It's about expectations. And although our society is nothing like it was when I was a lad, where you could divide people comfortably into working class, middle class, whatever, there is a very sharp dividing line between the people in our society who are brought up in families with high expectations and assumptions about the kind of work they will do, and who then move into organisations like ours and feel completely comfortable, on the one hand. And on the other hand, people who don't grow up in such families, who grow up expecting little or nothing, who come into organisations like ours and are put off by them or forbidden by them. And the agenda, to my mind, is about making sure that our organisations do not put off such people, but actually encourage them.
Matthew, this is not just about some rather 19th century, did you go to a public school, did you not go to a public school? Because actually we know that there's quite a sophisticated range of types of school within the public sector, public in the proper sense, not in the public school sense. But of course we've got programs, for example, something called Aim Higher, where we are targeting parts of the country, and we are targeting particular schools where there really is no tradition of students going to higher education. Now that seems to me to be a really sensible thing to do, because that's partly about driving up aspirations and thinking that it is something that you can do. But just one really interesting feature, because I think it does play into this whole argument, Matthew, about the Aim Higher programme, We often find that young people, say from some of the most deprived inner city areas, going out to visit universities from schools that have no tradition, turn up at Oxford or Cambridge or Bristol or wherever, or Glasgow or wherever, and get there and think, you know, this is good, and I have got the academic and intellectual ability to be here. But many of them then choose not to go there and end up going more likely to a university closer to them. And that's fine if they want to make that choice. But again, I think it's back to Bill's point. Often the choices you make are informed by a whole range of wider social influences on you.
I'll come to Danny Williams' question in a moment or two, but the lady there wanted to get in.
From the Cabinet Office. I was just interested in expectations and internal expectations, and wondered what the panel's view was about Faststream and perhaps that creating a class system within the civil service as well.
I mean, I think it's an interesting question because often you'll find the fast stream are not universally loved within departments. I mean, let's be frank about that. That is the case in departments. And it seems to me that one of the points we have to make to all staff is that the fast stream is one way into the organisation. And it's partly for competitive reasons because many other employers have graduate recruitment programmes. So therefore, we're doing that partly for competitive advantage. We want good graduates like anybody else. But that's not the only way that you can achieve success. And of course, smart fast streamers learn that very quickly, because if they don't learn it very quickly, they're soon put in their place.
I've kept Danny waiting long enough. Danny Williams.
Hi, Danny from the Ministry of Defence, currently on loan to the Government Office in the Southwest. The question I had was more to do with, we're talking about whether class matters, but I've got the feeling that isn't the people's perceptions on class mattering is the bigger issue. In the same way, I suppose, that we've had a history behind discrimination from various groups, whether it be a gender or a racial view. Is it now about changing people's perceptions of what different classes means, if indeed it still does?
And you went on, didn't you, to pose the question as well, is there a danger that debates like this make an issue of something that perhaps isn't there? Bill?
I think it is largely about perceptions. The reason I think this debate is worth having is that I think in pursuing the diversity agenda in the civil service, we've gone through a kind of journey in the last period of time in which we have started from the proposition that there are manifestly underrepresented groups at the top of our service: women, people from minority ethnic groups, people with disabilities, to name but three. And we pursued a programme that is about advancing through our organisations people who are in the underrepresented groups. And that's been the right thing to do. I mean, I don't question that for a moment. But increasingly, and I think of an event I was at a few weeks ago with a number of others, the debate is becoming more about not specific minorities or specifically underrepresented groups, but what is our organisation like to work with? Is it one that draws on all its talents? And diversity, I mean, if we are to be truly diverse, I think we need not just to ensure that we draw through our organisations to positions at the top, women, people from minority ethnic groups, etc. But we need also to ensure that those who start with disadvantages or with low expectations don't just perpetuate these disadvantages when they come into our organisation. And I think that's part of the diversity agenda and worth discussing.
Twin question, Tim. Firstly, perceptions. Secondly, whether it's right to have the whole debate.
Perceptions. My mum was a Jamaican immigrant to this country and from a very working class background, had a number of jobs and did whatever not. But her expectations probably beat anybody's in the whole world for what her children were going to achieve, because we were not going to be statistics, and there was no way that I could come home with a B and have a good explanation because she wanted an A all the time. And I hated her for it because I was like, I worked really hard for that, but she wanted to raise my level of expectation because she understood as an adult what was associated with me doing well at school and how that allowed me to climb the social mobility ladder. So it was very important to her that I did well at school, and I didn't quite understand it because I did other numerous things. But anyway, I won't share that with you now because there's recording devices around. But
Oh, cool.
no. Ministry of Defence and all that. No, it's not happening. For me, though, I think it's now we have a new generation who are coming through where class is not so much of the issue, and I think it's quite important that we don't, at the moment, measure class. We measure things that are sometimes associated with certain things of class, which people can see as tangible, for example, race and gender. And I think the bigger question is, what's more important for the civil service? Is it the strategy, which we can all find in a written document on the intranet or whatever not, we can see what it says, or is it the culture that we actually have within the organisation about how people move around, how we are promoting, how we support individual companies? And I myself, personally, with now my own organisation and working with others, I think the latter has to be where we put as much energy, because we can get people to write documents, we can do that. But we have to put as much energy into the culture of the organisation, because what's being said around the room is different for individuals, and that's what we really have to address.
If I may, I agree 100% with that. I think, my own view of this issue has changed over the few years I've been doing the diversity champion role. I now think it's entirely about that, really. And I come back to what I said earlier. One of the companies with whom we've been doing some work across the service is BT. And a phrase that they use to describe the organisation they would like to be is effortlessly inclusive. And I think that's the culture we should aspire to in the service, that everybody feels they have a place and everybody feels they can progress if they've got the talent to do so.
I'm going to come on to promotions in a moment because a couple of questions have been asked by that. But I can see a number of hands up. So why don't we have a quick fire, 3 or 4 questions that we can then ping back to the panel. A couple down here, first of all, and then to the gentleman there.
I wanted to make an observation more than a question, and it was regarding the question of FastStream. I'm a DWP in-service candidate for FastStream, and I wanted to reiterate the points about I came from a very, very working class background. My mum was a single parent. I left school before taking A-levels because of that, I had to go out and get a job. That job happened to be an AA in the Oval Departments of Health and Social Security a very long time ago. I don't think that the promotion system, like my colleague here, would have probably got me to the level that I am at the moment as HEO, because I was a bit gobby when I was younger, and that tends to stick to you to a degree. But in the last in-service candidates, the in-service competition for the FastStream, and it is a very rigorous selection process, but after a long time I was successful in that. I'm now Job Centre Manager at Easterhouse Job Centre. The very last point I wanted to make was, if people think that the civil service is not diverse as regards class, go back out to your offices and the places that you work in. If you're below SEO level as well, identify your staff that you think you would be able to help get onto FastStream, and really, really push that for people, because it's not something I would have thought of doing.
Okay, the gentleman in front of you.
Hi, David Wright from DCSF. I was going to ask, do you think the system actually stops people progressing and getting a good mix? Because the way we actually do the work is something now. So we can get people in, but to get them to progress and finding the work slightly daunting, is that another barrier?
I'll come to that in a moment, so bear that in mind. The gentleman there with his hand up, and then the gentleman with the striped tie, and then we'll throw it back to the panel. So the chap with the brown shirt there, if we can get to him. Thank you.
Anthony Carpen, Department for Communities and Local Government. Within my voluntary work as well as my day job, I actually get out and about to various communities, as well as doing online mentoring for would-be applicants in the civil service through a very popular website. One of the things that struck me is the aspirations from people from more educated backgrounds. They seem to know what the civil service does, and also that it exists. Yet when I go to more deprived communities, they don't even know the civil service exists for quite a few of them, let alone what it does. And then secondly, with the temping agencies, we'll come across a lot of temporary staff and contract workers, and a lot of the adverts are all down the shops in Victoria Street, rather than being in the communities where people from more diverse backgrounds live. So the question is, how do we deal with those?
Okay, a couple of good observations. I promised the chap in the striped tie, just behind you, that's right, a final thought before we come back to the panel.
David Rawlings. I work for the Ministry of Defence. I've just done a recruitment for an E1, which is at the old AO level. Of 179 applications, about 70% were degrees. And a great number of those were people who have just come out of university. So with your fast streams, and as Sue says, a bit of experience is going to make a hell of a lot of difference. And I'm rather worried that the people are just looking for jobs at the moment. That's what they want. They're not worried where it is.
So that's very interesting. So the current economic climate, whether we're actually targeting the right sort of areas, and a worry there also that it's the system, even once you're in. Sue, why don't you start first of all?
Well,
some, not all of those.
I completely agree that we need to continually be bringing people into the fast stream, not just new graduates. I'm a great fan of the in-service thing, and I think the best I mean, I wasn't in the fast stream myself, but I think the best role model we've got is Leslie Strathy, who joined the Employment Service, or DHSS, straight from school at 16 and is now the permanent secretary in charge of the Revenue and Customs, and that's a fantastic example of someone who has made it up through being jolly good at her job, and for no other reason really. So we do have some good role models. I think we do need to do a lot more in the way of mentoring programs and that kind of thing to encourage people up that kind of route, and that we really just need to show people that it can be done, show the outcomes and role models of people like yourself who have made it up. When I was in DFID, one of the people at the number 3 level was somebody who used to be a former professional footballer for Blackpool, and he'd become a civil servant when he was about 38, and he was now running our spending programs in Africa. An incredibly credible person with African leaders, I can tell you.
Can I just pick up on one theme which I thought Anthony raised and you raised, which is actually about all of us going out into the community. What we've got here is a huge, diverse group of civil servants, I imagine from a very, very wide range of backgrounds, people who care enough about the civil service to come to an event like this. So it shouldn't just be all of us at the top of the table here going out into the communities, but all of you, if you care passionately about the work you do, going back into your communities as you describe and you describe, I think is hugely important.
Now there's a question right there at the back with the woman in the red.
My name's Sally Sheldrake-Ormerod. I'm classified as posh because I went to private school and I have a double-barrelled surname. My father was an RAF sergeant, my mum was a housekeeper. Why am I being discriminated against because I don't have a degree and because I'm an E1? There are courses in the Ministry of Defence not available to E1s. I've been turned down by another department because I don't have a degree. Why? It's got nothing to do with my class.
It hasn't, and I think, I mean, maybe you'd like to tell me something about this afterwards since it's a departmental issue, but certainly it is the case that there are some routes to advancement that do rest on educational qualifications. I think that's true within the civil service, it's true in other walks of life as well. But I'm quite happy to look at your own experience if you'd like me to do so.
Go on, Tim.
So, in terms of some of the points that were mentioned, I have a massive issue with people saying about a system because it kind of divorces responsibility also, and it's as helpful as comments like institutional racism and all that. I don't think that works. I think people manage systems, and we need to look at people in terms of if things aren't going right. In terms of getting the message out to more people, I've just spent the last couple of months going around the country with the Department for Work and Pensions around local employment partnerships, which have been fantastic about engaging employers to talk about job opportunities directly with people. We could do the same thing with the job centres, actually go out and use the methods that are already in existence. FastStream, I have no problem with FastStream. I'm all for creating competition in workplaces because I think that encourages people to motivate, as long as there's support for those who are successful on the FastStream once they get into their positions and they're not left out to hang out to dry. And for those who are not successful, they're also supported about how they can be developed to find other opportunities or potentially go back again. The current economic climate, I'm sick and tired of people just talking about the negative sides of the economic climate in terms of recession, redundancy and repossession, the negative 3 Rs. I think there's a fantastic opportunity here for resources for us to actually, so I said the royal us again, please apologise. I'm not looking for a job, by the way, no. For us to go out into those individuals who have the degrees, who are waiting around for jobs, and actually be more selective about the opportunities they can have within the civil service. Because if we're trying to upskill, there's a wider pool now, as was it from the example there, that are waiting to be nurtured and probably brought in if we can serve them what the civil service is about.
So it's an opportunity. Now, I'm going to bring the lady there who's been very patiently waiting for a question. But before I do, a lot of people have mentioned promotion at various stages. Can I just ask with a show of hands, people who do think that somehow what we've been talking about this morning does filter in to that whole equation about getting promotions and getting jobs within the civil service currently as it stands? What I would say about a third to a half. And just so we're scientifically accurate, do the others think not, or some unsure? People that think it doesn't play into the equation? So I think slightly more. I just wonder if we could go back to the original group. I'll just take a couple at random. Just, again, those people who originally put their hands up, why do you think it does?
I think I'm in revenue and customs at the moment, and certainly if you get beyond a certain level, once you get into the senior civil service range, I've only ever met members of the senior civil service within my department who are white middle-class men. That's my experience.
Somebody else who, chap there in the pink tie, and that point comes back to, I think, what you were saying right at the start in terms of the top levels, weren't you?
Andrew Morgan from Ministry of Defence. My own experience is that 14 years ago I was unsuccessful at applying to the fast stream, but nonetheless have reached a grade 6 equivalence. So should I bother to apply for the senior civil service? Because the perception within the department is that having gone through the assessment centre, the results then go to a smoke-filled room for moderation, and if your face fits, you get it, and if it doesn't, you don't.
So you were nodding your head, so why don't you answer that point directly? Should he?
You should definitely apply, because I think there is I do not think there are smoke-filled rooms. I mean, I don't know what department you're from, but certainly the processes that I've chaired have been very transparent. We always have external members. And I think that something that you can propose that would guarantee that is to have staff members on panels, because that ensures transparency, no funny business, but it also brings a dimension of what you're looking for in senior civil servants being good people to work for.
The lady there.
Thank you. I just want, Wendy Violentano from the Department for Work and Pensions. I wanted to make a couple of positive comments, particularly in relation to my grade 6 colleague over there. As a working class girl who went to a comprehensive in Yorkshire with no degree, direct entrance to the civil service, having been in other sectors, and then recently made the leap to the senior civil service, yes, absolutely, you should go for promotion, because you can do it.
Thanks very much. We haven't got long left, but let's go to a question from Jerry Gower. If there we go. Just there, that's right.
Thank you. From the Ministry of Defence, with a large proportion of the cabinet, shadow cabinet, coming from a public school background, i.e. David Cameron in Eton Friends and Labour Party Tony Blair, does the panel think that it's important that senior civil servants are from the same class background?
Well, I better start answering all these MOD questions, I think. I mean, the one that's just been asked, I don't think it is important. I think for all the reasons we've been discussing, we should aim for a classless top of the civil service, full stop. I don't necessarily accept the premise of the question, but you wouldn't expect me to. If I could just pick up on the earlier MOD question, I really do give you an assurance that whatever else it is, the SCS assessment centre process is not a smoke-filled room. It's explicitly designed to replace what existed before and which was more like a smoke-filled room. I have my doubts about it myself because I think it can be rather too grindingly about individual competencies. But the worry that the person who asked the question 5 minutes or so ago has, that there's no point in applying because this is all settled somewhere else, it could not be further from the truth. I give that assurance.
Now, we are nearly out of time, so I've got one more question, but the lady with her hand up at the back, just the front row in that section there, that's right.
From the Home Office. I just wanted to know where you see all this going, because I'm currently line managing one of the BME summer interns, and he is phenomenal, and like most of the other people on the internship, studying at Cambridge, very middle class, very well educated, very upper class, but he ticks the BME box. Are we going to end up with some kind of diversity points-based system? Is that where this is all going? Because it seems like if you kind of account for one thing, we're kind of not accounting for other things. And similarly on that, I'm actually a fast streamer, so apologies in advance. But a lot of people on my floor didn't know that because I was ashamed of that fact. Because there is such a negative backlash on anybody who's perceived to be on the fast stream who happens to be kind of in my position. Do you think that that's going to negatively impact in the future in the kind of opposite end of the diversity scale?
Bill, why don't you take that? Just the twin thought, that factor about fast stream, but the first part of the question, probably the most interesting bit about where it ends up and actually, do you want to be where the question was actually hinted?
Yeah. Well, first of all, on the fast stream, provided we have a vibrant in-service access to the fast stream and really encourage everybody to pitch in for it. I'm unashamedly elitist about it. I mean, I think big successful organisations outside want to identify the talent for the future and get them into the right sorts of jobs so that they can flourish, and we should be no different from that. On your other point, I agree, and it's one of the reasons why I think this session has been worth having. If we're not careful on the conventional diversity agenda, we end up just ticking boxes in the way that you describe. Sue mentioned earlier our colleague Suma Chakrabarti, whom I have a huge regard for, but who says himself, if you think that in having me as a minority ethnic permanent secretary, you've achieved diversity, you're kidding yourself, because Suma is a man from a very middle-class background. So I agree with you. I think we have to widen this debate, and we have to be clear that we're not just ticking boxes.
I've got a final question from Nadia Khalifa, which I'm going to come to, but not before the lady there who's got the microphone, who's waited quite a long time.
I think this links back to the original question about does class matter? I've recently done a 2-year secondment to the Foreign Office, which is a rather interesting culture to work within. And what I noticed there is there's now more people in skirts and with different coloured skins, but they're middle class, private school, Oxbridge educated. Is that really diversity? And if you are seeing more diverse people coming through, are they just being selected because they're the right class?
Sue, why don't you take that? Because I think you had 3 years in the Foreign Office, didn't you?
I did have 3 years in the Foreign Office, and I was the only woman round the table at that job in Washington. And I was told that the language around the table changed quite significantly when I came in, so that was interesting. I think we are looking for the best people, and I think that I don't want anyone to go away from this session today thinking that we have positive discrimination in any of these things. What we want is a really good range of people to apply, to choose the best, and then to give opportunities for everyone to bring out their potential. So we're not picking people because they're women or they're not white or whatever. We're picking them because we think they're going to be very good at their jobs.
Yes, we never got to the question from Monica Saunders, but I'll paraphrase it because I think you would all agree, because she made the point that even when class matters, should education, experience, skills, abilities not matter more? And I suspect that there's a sort of unanimity of thought there. Now, I said I'll bring in Nadia Khalifa. So Here? Not here? Nadia? Not here. So I will paraphrase her question, which is, in a modern civil service, do you think it's acceptable for civil servants to dress down in jeans when they're not meeting ministers or external partners? If it is, should the pressure be to smarten up? Paul?
It's completely acceptable. I have no problem at all. I employ quite a lot of Australian and New Zealand legal temps, and they completely change the atmosphere of the office because they don't adopt the sort of conventional dress style that I adopt. And I was talking to one of the new ones the other day, and you know, he was very unconventionally dressed by my standards. And I said, "What do you do if you have to go to court?" And he said, "Oh, there are 5 of us, and we've had a whip round, and we have 1 suit between the 5 of us that we keep in the office." So I said, if 2 of you need to go to court, I'll chip in to buy the 2nd suit. It shouldn't matter at all.
I'm going to go right down the line. Sue?
I think it's all right when you're not going to meetings or seeing ministers or external stakeholders or dealing with the public. I think it is a mark of respect to all those people that when you are dealing with them, that you do look reasonably smart.
I should always draw the line at flip-flops, actually, something about toes, but that's just me. Bill?
I agree with what Sue's just said completely.
I'm quite old-fashioned in this regard because there's a bit of a joke in our office that if you're going to come on to the 7th floor where I work, you have to get your shoes polished because I have a particular fetish about polished shoes. And I hope you like my tie this morning as well.
And finally, Tim.
I think it comes down to my original point about culture versus strategy. It's really what the culture of the organisation says. And is it more important that the individual is able to articulate himself and get across the message what they're trying to portray, or what suit they're wearing? I was at a Japanese bank the other day, and it was very important that we walked in with ties, shoes polished, and nails cut and everything else. It was a prerequisite, but that's the culture, and it's what's important to the people you're going to show respect for them.
Well, there we are. Time has defeated us, but thanks very much for all of your questions, the ones you sent in, the ones you asked. And thank you to Tim, to David, to Bill, to Sue, and to Paul. And thanks to all of you very much.